Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Danny, and I am with the learning team at Cherry Bekaert. Just want to go over a few quick housekeeping items before we get started today. For audio during today's webinar, you may listen through the phone or the computer speakers. You can choose your audio under the audio tab in the menu to the right of your screen. Turn CPE for today's webinar. Please make sure you answer all the polling questions. You make sure that you click the Submit Answer button to submit your answer. Instructors will try to remind you of this as each poll appears. The instructors and I will answer questions in the question and answer pod. We will try to answer them throughout the webinar. So that's all for the housekeeping announcements, and I'll turn over to Mark.
Hello, good morning, everybody. I'm Mark Cooter. I am the firm leader for our real estate and construction practice for Cherry Bekaert. I sit in Greenville, South Carolina. I want to welcome you to the second day of our 4-day webinar series tailored for the real estate and construction industry. Each session will begin at 8:30 and end approximately about 9:30. We will hope you'll join us for each day. We have focused each topic based on a topic of interest currently within the industry. And watching in person will allow participants continuing education, and the sessions will also be recorded and available on cbh.com. At Cherry Bekaert, we are committed to offering a series of resources and programs designed to share industry best practices while limiting your financial burden, and we hope that you find these sessions beneficial. Yesterday, Bryce Gardner discussed how to leverage analytics in real estate and construction. On Friday, we will dive into distressed real estate post-COVID-19 and year-end planning for real estate and construction companies. For more information on how to register for each, please visit cbh.com and navigate to the events section. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists and get started for the day.
Thanks, Mark. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us this morning for what will hopefully be a really good conversation about a great community development project here in Greenville, South Carolina. Judson Mill is our topic of discussion today. My name is Whitney Ferguson, and I am the program manager for the Innovate Fund. I will kick us off here in a moment, but before I start introducing some of my fellow speakers, I wanted to give just a brief overview of today's webinar. So we'll start off with an overview of the Judson community. We'll give some brief history on the Judson Mill site, and then we'll jump into the financing of the transaction, and we'll cover several community development financing tools that were used by the development team to make the project possible. So we'll be covering New Markets tax credits, community development financial institutions, federal historic tax credits, and a couple of South Carolina state tax credits as well. And the way that we'll do that is we'll give an overview of each of them, and then we'll isolate each one of those as it relates to the structure of the financial transaction, so that we're showing you how some of these different tools can be used together. So I'm going to try to play more of a moderator role today, in addition to speaking on behalf of the Innovate Fund, which was the New Markets tax credit lender in the transaction. We've pulled together some really awesome representatives from several other parties in the transaction. We have Ken Reiter, who is the president and founder of Belmont Sayre. Ken is a big part of the development and sponsor team, and he's one of the biggest reasons that any of this was possible. Also with us today is Steve Ross, the NMTC program director of Truist Community Capital, and Christina Sapanski, the managing director of Southeast and Structured Finance with Reinvestment Fund. So we'll each take just a minute here at the top to introduce ourselves and our organizations, so you can get used to each of our faces and our voices, and then I promise we'll get into some of the good stuff. So I'll go ahead and kick us off here with an overview of the Innovate Fund, which is partially owned by Cherry Bekaert. The Innovate Fund is a certified community development entity, or CDE, and Steve will tell us a little bit more about what CDEs are and their roles in the new markets world a little bit later, but we have a mission of providing access to capital in the form of below market loans to projects and businesses within a 4-state service area: Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Tennessee. And we focus that capital on projects that either create quality jobs or increase health and wellness within those 4 states. So to date, we've secured 277 million of new markets allocation and deployed all of that as well. And we've been able to fund projects that have created over 6,000 direct jobs and served over 70,000 people through additional access to community services and construct or rehab 2.4 million square feet of real estate. And I will let Ken take it from here to tell you a little bit about himself.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Ken Reiter. I appreciate everybody taking time out of their mornings. As Whitney mentioned, the company that I own is called Belmont Sayre. On this particular transaction, we're partnered with the Taft family, actually out of Greenville, North Carolina. And there'll be a common theme in the conversation about relationships, because that's what it really takes to get a project like Judson Mill done and a financing on the new market tax credit and historic tax credit side. So I'll get into that a little bit further about the Taft organization and how we got together. But as far as my company, we're headquartered in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Originally grew up in Chicago, found my way down here and got involved in community development utilizing historic tax credits, new market tax credits, brownfield tax credits, other types of energy tax credits. We do a little bit of new construction, but I'd say most of what we do is historic rehab in disinvested areas. So it kind of hits the crosshairs of the new market tax credit world. The Taft family, Tom Taft and his family are out of Greenville, North Carolina. It's a third generation family that is doing projects primarily in the Southeast, North Carolina, South Carolina. There was a former development relationship with one of their principals that got them involved in Greenville. And they're a large-scale multifamily commercial developer. And I'll talk a little bit more about their role in the overall project. So I'm glad everybody's here, and we'll get further into the deal and the financing here shortly.
Thanks, Ken. I'll go ahead. My name is Steve Roth. I am the New Markets Tax Credit Program Director for Truist Community Capital. Truist, as most of you all know, is the name of the new merged bank between SunTrust and BB&T. We play a couple different roles in the new markets tax credit industry. Primarily, we're an investor where we're partnering up with third-party CDEs like the Innovate Fund or Reinvestment Fund and many others. We provide debt to certain transactions, whether it's long-term, short-term, bridge debt, et cetera. But we're also a community development entity, and our CDE has won 10 allocations totaling 643 million of allocation. And as an organization, we've closed over $2 billion on new markets tax credit transactions. So really proud of the work that we do throughout the Mid-Atlantic and the Southeast. And I know we're going to be asking questions or taking questions from the panel later, but I have to ask Ken a quick question. Chicago, does that make you a Cubs fan or a White Sox fan?
So my company, you'll like this. So my company name is Belmont Sayre. Those are the cross streets I grew up, and I'm actually a Cubs fan. So I'm a North Sider.
Wrong answer. All right, on to Christina.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Christina Sapanski, and I am at Reinvestment Fund. I have been there for almost 13 years. It's a CDFI, one of the largest in the country. Headquartered in Philadelphia, I relocated to Atlanta, Georgia, where I am today, to open a Southeast office for an 8-state region. And we actually, as a CDFI, we do lending and mission impact lending, but we also do grants management. We do a lot of data analytics and analysis, which goes alongside any of our lending. I also wear a hat of running our new market tax credit program. We've received over 600 million of allocation and awards over a 12-year period, and we are currently investing our 60 million award for 2020. In this transaction, we played the role of CDFI lending directly into the project and also as a leverage source lender. And we'll learn more about all the different roles that we can play later.
Great, thanks, Christina. And we have got the first of our 4 polling questions here. So if you want your CPE credit, everyone take a minute and let us know what your primary role is. I think we're giving about 45 seconds for everyone to answer these. I think the breakdown here will help guide us a little bit on knowing certain things to focus on throughout the presentation. Wish I had given more options, a lot of others out there.
I know, I'm so curious what all the others are.
Yeah, do we get to see the results? Yeah.
If you're an other and you wanted, type in what your role is in the chat box.
Please, thank you.
Cool.
All right, so I
I
think
think our
that
next
means
poll question is going to be about whether or not you should root for the Cubs or the White Sox, but we'll come back to that.
we'll see.
Do we know what the, hey, Whitney, this is Ken. Do we know what the others are, roughly? What the makeup is? Just curious.
They start typing.
Yeah, maybe we'll get some answers to that.
Yeah, that's fine. I don't need
going a little bit.
Okay.
All right.
Well,
So
you want me to jump in?
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about Judson Mill.
Yeah. So, I can talk for a long time. I've been told to keep it brief. So, I'd love to talk about the fantastic projects we have. But I will kind of tie into just, how did we get here? Relationships. I'll tell a quick story and then we'll move in. We're headquartered in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, do mostly historic rehab in Winston-Salem and Durham and smaller markets throughout. We got involved in Judson Mill about 5 years ago. A contingent of downtown cheerleaders from Greenville came up to Durham, North Carolina. I was part of a similar panel to this back in the day. As some of the downtown Greenville folks came into Durham, got to meet those folks. At the same time, in North Carolina, they were in the process of sunsetting their historic tax credit program. It was uncertain whether or not it was going to be extended. Because we work in that area, I started looking at other markets that we could do historic tax credit deals. The group from Greenville said, look, there's a very robust historic tax credit program, and there's lots of mills. I had heard a lot about Greenville. I had not visited. And over the course of time, we looked at several different mill projects in and around Greenville. And ultimately, we went under contract and purchased the Judson Milliken property, Milliken being the operating company, Judson being the historic name. So, and when we got to town, we typically knock on a lot of doors. So Whitney and Tammy were some of the first people that we contacted and said, look, why, does the community care about this project? Can it be successful? How might it be successful? And there were about 4 or 5 other groups, looking at the property. We were the only group that was looking to redevelop the site. Most other developers were just going to clear the site, knock the buildings down, and do single-family residential, which is needed in Greenville as a growing market. I wouldn't say it was a gating issue, but I think it was important to the community to kind of re-knit this back into the community because it had been, basically an operating mill for about over 100 years. So I wouldn't say new markets was an afterthought because I know I talked to Tammy and Whitney a lot about getting an allocation and securing an allocation and wouldn't it be great? So it was always in the back of our mind. And I will tell everybody, it is a limited resource. They're very competitive. However, they're very, very powerful. So, what are the basics of the new market program? You're basically working in a distressed census tract, and it's areas that, the program brings private investment, into an area that would often struggle. So the screen that you're looking at right now, it's a relatively small census tract, high poverty, median family income is 30% of the median. It's incredibly low family income. And the employment rate's a little bit misleading. I think this is 2010 statistics, Whitney, do you recall?
2015. 2015.
So think back. Yes, today it might be different, but that was probably 5 times the state average, or pretty close, right? So unemployment was high. It's in an Appalachian region area. It's a distressed area. And HFFI, basically, there's within the U.S. Treasury, and Christina can talk about this a little bit more, there's a healthy foods initiative within the Treasury. This is a certified food desert, which means there is low access to healthy foods. So that ties into some of the programming that we went through. You can go to the next slide.
Working on it. There we go.
Yeah. And let me know if there's any questions. I'm kind of moving through this stuff. So this is the project. It's 36 acres. It has 800,000 square feet of historic properties. There's a multi-phase project that we are pursuing right now. Building number 1 is under construction, as is building number 2. Building number 2 is the project, is the new market transaction. And as part of our redevelopment initiative, you know, one of the things that we recognized, and we do throughout the projects that we work on across North Carolina, South Carolina, and the Southeast, is that there's a missing middle. So workforce housing was a very important component. It was helpful in securing the new market tax credits. I don't think it was a gating issue, but it was important to understand that, you know, community impact is really what underlies the new market tax credit programming. The financing is obviously very powerful, very helpful, but in exchange for the private sector investment that comes along with the new markets, it's really important to demonstrate impact. And having a project that has, in addition to the direct impacts that come from the new markets, having other components, I think, is helpful. To give you a scale of things, building number 1 and building number 2, that's approximately 450,000 square feet of the 800,000 square feet on the campus. So we're a little bit over, you know, 60% of the overall, you know, project is underway. There's a little bit of demolition. And then we're looking quickly to get additional phases off the ground, maybe some additional allocation if it warrants it. And I'm sure I'll be talking to Whitney and Christina and Stephen about, you know, additional support on the campus. All new infrastructure. We work closely with the city in redeveloping the site, getting favorable redevelopment rules, you know, to allow the redevelopment to happen in the manner that we need it to. We believe there's a market for additional office space. We would like to bring additional folks out of downtown, ample parking right along the line. I didn't say I'd say Clemson University about, you know, if you follow Easley Bridge Road west, you will run into Clemson. So we like the geographic location here. It's out of downtown, but close enough. It's in a burgeoning neighborhood. And our whole goal was to basically redevelop Judson Mill and knit it back into the historic distressed community that was surrounding it, as opposed to, you know, causing further gentrification. So, you know, building in the workforce housing and community slash neighborhood uses was really important, and we'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about the uses.
I appreciate the first reference to Clemson, so go Tigers, since Steve got us.
I was trying to figure out a way. So anyway, so this is, you know, the timeline. So we I should say me and Tom Taft and I are partners, along with my other partner, Matt Springer. So between Ken, Tom, and Matt, we own 100% of the project. But we are the second owners. It's always been in the Milliken Judson family. So that's actually really interesting. And 2015 is when the operations stopped. We acquired it in 2017, and our major gating due diligence items on Judson was really environmental conditions. You know, typically these large former mill sites are riddled with environmental matters, and that can be a good thing and a bad thing. From our perspective as developers, we actually look
Ken, we've lost your audio.
No?
Wait, I think we've got it back.
Am I back now?
Oh, you're back.
Where did you? Sorry. Okay, sorry. I was gonna say, where did you lose me? I was talking about the historics.
Yeah, maybe about 15 seconds ago.
Okay, I was gonna say the two major gating issues were the environmental and the historic. We put the property into the South Carolina Brownfield program, and we also worked through getting the historic designations both at the state and federal level. So, you know, entitling the project for the environmental and the historic really led the way for the further redevelopment. We closed on our financing on the workforce housing on building number 1 in 2019. And then just a few months ago, we closed on the historic new market financing on building number 2. And there's mountains of due diligence. There's a lot, you know, synthesized in that long period of time, but it's been my first visit to the site was back in 2015. So it was about 4 years from, you know, first boots on the ground to working through purchase and sale with a large corporate client. It's, you know, there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah. So let's just zoom in on building 2 for a quick minute. Ken, maybe just give us a little bit about that particular building and a little bit about the tenants you've got already lined up for that space.
That's right. So this is the heart of the new market transaction, building number 2. It's a 100,000 square foot property. The major components are Feed and Seed. Feed and Seed is a local nonprofit. For those of you who are from the Greenville area, they are basically a farmer to table organization. They process, I'll call it B grade produce. It's the carrot that has a little bit of a curve to it. You won't find it at your grocery store, but it's perfectly good, has all the nutrition. And what Feed and Seed does is they will bring that produce from the farm, working with farmers throughout the upstate, bring them to Judson. They will process them, clean them, package them, and then distribute back out to the neighborhood, to churches, to hospitals, to schools, and actually work with baking prepaid or prepared lunches. They will also provide a cafe and a restaurant service for the tenants on our property. It's incredibly innovative. The lead over there is a woman named Mary Hip, who has been just instrumental in working with us, and it's going to create an enormous impact on the neighborhood that has pretty high levels of health disparities, and we're hoping that having access to the Feed and Seed food will be helpful. Raccoon Climbing is a rock climbing gym. It'll be the largest, it's called bouldering facility in the Southeast. A gentleman named Doug Johnson is the lead on that. That's under construction. In the neighborhood, there is Hollis Elementary, which is an elementary school as part of the Greenville County Schools. And then there's also a YMCA after-school program, and it's called the Judson Mill Y. That's run by the local organization. The ownership group will be sponsoring a fitness center on the facility that helps residents and for office users, but will be also open to the community. And the YMCA will be managing that facility for us. And then to try to bring a little bit of nighttime activity, there's a tenant called Cowboy Up. It's a live music venue run by a local entrepreneur named Howard Dozier, who has several different facilities.
Ken, we lost your audio again. No. All right. I think while we let Ken sort through his audio issues, I think he's given us a good background on Judson and his involvement and the vision for Building 2. So we'll sort of switch now and start focusing a little bit on how Ken and his team were able to pull together the financing for Building 2. So I've pulled together the sources and uses for the project. It was total $18.8 million in redevelopment costs. And you're probably thinking, this doesn't look that complicated. There's only 4 total sources coming in here. It's not that bad. But this is the simplest version of the sources and uses as I could muster up. And the reason for that is I've got all 16.5 million in new market tax credits that were allocated to the project from the Innovate Fund coming in as a single source. But what you'll learn during the rest of the presentation is that number is actually made up of several different sources. So this simple chart turns into this very complicated financing structure. And I won't spend too much time on this chart right now. It is color coded though. So for instance, all 3 of the navy blue boxes are the project sponsor or affiliated entities of the project sponsor, which would be Ken and his partners. Also, the lighter blue boxes are both Truist owned or affiliated entities. So from here on out, we'll start specifically talking about certain parts of the structure, and then we'll isolate the boxes in the structure that represent each of those. And new markets are one of the biggest reasons that we've got this complicated structure. So I think it makes sense that we start there. And before we dive into that with Steve, we've got our second polling question. So do you know what new markets tax credits are? Options are yes, no, or in name only for those of you that have heard of it, but that's really the extent of your knowledge. And don't be ashamed to check that last box. Good number of yeses.
Hey, Whitney, can you hear me now? I'm not sure if my audio is working. Okay.
You're
Yes.
back.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
Half and half. That's pretty
Yeah,
informative.
we've got a good split here on new markets knowledge.
Interesting.
Okay, I think that means the poll has closed. So Steve, I will toss it to you to give everybody an intro on what new market tax credits are.
Thanks, Whitney. And again, thanks everybody for taking the time this morning. Yeah, so new markets tax credit, sounds like about half of you are familiar with it. The other half of you are probably sitting here thinking, let's get into the meat and figure out what this is, right? So let me describe this to you in one simple phrase. New markets tax credits is gap financing for commercial projects in low-income areas, right? And it's a broad program, as you can tell, because I didn't say housing, I didn't say mixed use, I didn't say retail or healthcare or manufacturing. It's a program designed to help commercial projects and economic investment in those specific communities and help what is the focus of that community, because every community is different, right? It is a federal program that's administered by the Department of Treasury, specifically by the CDFI fund. And the goal, again, is to stimulate investment, to attract investors like Truist and others to bring our capital and invest more heavily in these low-income areas. We're trying to create jobs. We're trying to create access to healthy foods. We're trying to create access to education and healthcare. The idea here, more than anything else, is to provide services to the underserved and low-income communities. And that's really what's driving the entire program. But as Ken said earlier, and you'll see in the bottom of this first slide, is a very competitive program. And we're going to talk, starting with this next slide, just kind of how it works. So how does the program work? Essentially, what you have out there are a number of organizations, hundreds and hundreds of them around the country, called community development entities, or CDEs. And they are really the driving force behind the New Markets Tax Credit Program. They're made up of a variety of different types of entities, everything from nonprofits to for-profits. And what they're trying to do is they work to bring this gap financing to communities. They have to apply every year to the federal government, to the CDFI fund, for an allocation of New Markets Tax Credits. And from that point, once they've been awarded credits, and you've heard earlier, Whitney and Christina and I all work with CDEs. We have CDEs at our firms that have been successful attracting this allocation in the past. Once we get these funds, these CDEs are the ones that get to decide which projects get financed. It's not state and local government. It's not federal government. It is a true public-private partnership. The public and the federal government entrust us as CDEs because we have a track record of investment in low-income areas. They say, you all are going to be the decision makers. You all are going to be working on these programs, boots on the ground. So the CDEs have to go into the local communities. We have to find the qualifying businesses, whether it's, could be equipment, could be real estate, all the various different types, and we select them. And it is a competitive process, not just for the CDEs to get allocation. It's even more competitive for projects like Ken's to go out and find allocation. And so what really ends up happening is we work very closely with local community members, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, to identify those projects that are going to best suit the communities. And then the CDEs have to work in partnership with an investor like Truist to monetize tax credits. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But the idea here is the CDEs bring the tax credits, the investors turn those tax credits into the dollars, and then those CDEs essentially take that money and lend it to the project. And then you can see that the project sources, these can be used for a lot of things, whether it's acquisition, construction, equipment, and usually these are structured in the form of low interest-only loans. So why don't we jump to the next slide really quickly, and you'll see, one of the things that happens, this is a 7-year program, so usually these are going to be at least 7-year loans. And as an investor, which is what Truist does, we're in it for the tax credits, right? We are investing dollars up front to get a 7-year stream of credit. And so we work in partnership with the CDEs and the borrowers to make sure that the business stays in compliance with the program during that 7-year period. For us as an investor, we get the economic returns from the federal tax credits, but more importantly, we get CRA credit from the federal government. That's really important for us to meet our goals with the regulators. And then even more important than that is that we're doing good in the communities, right? We are able to help our clients and those communities that they are serving bring what is absolutely critical to help those to help. And on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about those impacts and what we're looking to see. So on the right-hand side, you can see what's the benefit to the borrower to accessing New Markets tax credits. Really, the idea here is that they're going to get low interest-only debt. It's going to, oftentimes we have a lot of other flexible terms. It can be subordinate to other lenders. You're not going to typically see the same types of covenants from other transactions that you'd see, where you're not going to see debt service coverages and loan to values. The idea here is this is meant to be flexible capital. And the idea, for the most part, it depends on the CDEs and their structures, but oftentimes a significant portion, if not all of that New Markets tax credit investment can be, for lack of a better term, it does not have to be repaid at the end. Usually there's a put-call process where if the economic returns for the investor have been met and the project has stayed in compliance, then they have the ability to acquire their New Markets tax credit loans for a very low price, maybe $1,000. So it's very, very low cost capital that helps the projects, again, acquire buildings, renovate buildings, purchase equipment, et cetera. But it is a shallow credit. And as you can see on the left-hand side, what we're doing with New Markets tax credits is bringing the last 15 to 20% to a specific project to get it done. And what I mean by that, so that's why I described it as a shallow credit, and why at the very beginning I described it as gap financing. New Markets tax credits tends to be the last in money, because you need to be able to identify where all the leverage is coming, and that leverage source is what we're looking for whenever we go to projects. And I know Ken talked about the work that goes into bringing all of these sources together. That's really critical. Like for Whitney and her team at the Innovate Fund, it was super critical for them to be able to identify where all the other funds were coming to before they could commit and close on New Markets tax credits. Because New Markets tax credits aren't designed to be the first in, they're designed to be the last in to help projects get done.
And you have to have all of those sources on day one, fully funded, which is very different from other projects which, drip in with disbursements. The other thing I wanted to add, Steve, is that not only are the New Markets flexible, the program is flexible and works with, as you'll see with Judson, with so many different credits, right? Historic tax credits, even opportunity zones can pair well with the New Markets program.
That's right. I think it works really well with everything except for low-income housing tax credits. And there are a few USDA loan programs that are tricky, but we're working on that. We're still trying to get them to play fair in the sandbox. But the key, why don't we jump to the next slide? The key to this more than anything else is what I like to describe as community alignment. And what I mean by that is that it's great for a business to show up and say, hey, we're going to create jobs, or we're going to create healthcare or education opportunities. But is that really what the community needs? So you can see on here some information about community outreach, right? Like working with community associations, with the YMCA, with the county councilwoman. Really, the idea behind finding a successful New Markets Tax Credit project is making sure that not only is it going to provide goods and services or jobs, but these are the goods and services and the jobs that are needed in that community. And that's something that I know that the CDEs and Whitney in particular, like you guys work really, really hard to make sure that the information, that these projects are not just good projects, but they're good for that area. And so you can see here through this community outreach, there are specific needs that have been identified, right? There's a need for access to workforce housing and access to healthy foods. Ken already highlighted earlier the fact that this is a census tract with extremely high poverty and low area median income. So the benefits that you're going to see from an investment like this are quality jobs, right? And jobs that are accessible to low-income people, providing services to the low-income community members, and then even more so providing below-market rents to not-for-profit tenants, right? That's actually something that I think oftentimes gets overlooked in the New Markets Tax Credit program. Is this is not just a subsidy, so to speak, for the developer or the owner of the business. Oftentimes the benefits, and the goal is that the benefits are going to impact those users, right? So oftentimes it allows them to provide services at below market or inexpensive costs, because they are saving so much money on the front end. But again, really, really key to this, and if somebody were working on a new project, it's not just good enough to qualify, and it can't just be in a low-income census tract and say, this is the project that we want to do. You've got to demonstrate that it's going to have significant impacts and that those impacts align with the needs of that area.
I would just make one quick. I would just say one quick comment, Steve. Is the but for, right? Which is really important. There's the but for argument on the New Market program, which is without this additional equity or funding, we couldn't provide the below market rents, right? The sources and uses wouldn't balance. Christina would never give us the loan. There'd be a gap, and the private sector can't get it there. So that's really what this serves, and it's pretty innovative.
Absolutely. And Whitney, if you want to jump to the next slide really quickly, we can touch more on the financing piece, the New Markets Tax Credit piece, because what you'll see there is exactly what he's talking about is, we have a project that costs $18.8 million. And then ultimately what's happening is Ken and his team have to bring in a significant amount of capital, but they can't bring 100%. And he mentioned earlier, we've got significant costs for environmental issues. Right? Anybody who's ever done an historic tax credit project knows as soon as you start breaking ground and doing demolition, can of worms, right? That the costs just jump and jump and jump and jump. So in looking at debt and looking at historic tax credit equity, both state and federal, you have to bring together a lot of different pieces to make these projects come together. And it's not at all uncommon for New Markets tax credits to be layered with multiple other sources. And we're going to talk more about those other sources. But as you can see here, the idea on this New Markets Tax Credit program is for this piece of it, you've really got three main parties, right? You've got the Innovate Fund at the center, which is the CDE. They brought the tax credits to the project. And what they've done is they said, hey, if you see on the left-hand side of the arrow, they're saying, Truist, we're effectively going to sell you $6.4 million worth of tax credits over a 7-year period as long as you provide equity for that. And so Truist is providing $4.9 million worth of equity to the project, and we're providing it to an investment fund. That's just a pooling entity that's owned by the investor, but that's the gap, right? Ken and his team are required to provide the sponsor leverage, the $12.3 million that they bring to the table. And ultimately what ends up happening is what we're doing is we're combining equity and leverage debt. We're putting that into an investment fund that then invests into the CDE and to get those credits. And then the CDE takes those proceeds and lends them to the project. So yes, in fact, Ken's team is borrowing money or bringing their own sponsor equity to the table in some as well. You can see there's just shy of $2 million of equity at the upper tier as well. They are bringing equity, they are bringing debt, and they are effectively lending their money back to themselves through Whitney. But the reason this is structured this way is the CDFI fund and the IRS worked together for years to say, look, what we want to do is find a mechanism to combine equity, combine debt, and provide this gap financing solution. So the structure that you see here is very, very typical for deals. So sort of the boxes here where you've got an investor providing equity, You've got a sponsor who is taking together various sources and providing the leverage debt. You've got a CDE that's taking those proceeds and ultimately lending them to the project for a 7-year period. And that's really the way the New Markets Tax Credits work, is sponsor brings their money, investor brings their money, and ultimately we have to have, to Christina's point, we have to have all of the funds there on the day of closing. And really, in order to get Whitney's interest as a CDE, or Christina or my interest as a CDE as well, Ken and his team have to demonstrate that they have the leverage, but that they also need the subsidy.
Yep, absolutely. So we need 16.5 million in this investment fund box, and Steve has been nice enough through Truist to give us 4.9, but now we're going to talk a little bit about where that 12.3 comes from and sort of the process that Ken went through to bring it to the table. Before we jump to our next source, though, polling question number 3, have you ever worked with a community development financial institution, or a CDFI? Choices are yes, no, or never even heard of those. Not as many never even heard of those as I would have thought.
But a lot of no's, so there's opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. We'll wait just a minute for that to close.
Oh.
Okay. All right, so as you've probably guessed, CDFIs are our next topic of discussion. So I will hand it over to Christina to talk about what CDFIs are and what their importance is within the community development finance world.
Thanks, Whitney. So CDFIs, community development financial institutions, are essentially mission-driven financial organizations that are not that dissimilar from community development entities. We're accountable to the community, and the goal of CDFIs is access to capital. For borrowers, businesses, even individuals in some cases, depending on the CDFI, because traditional sources, typically banks, are not able to finance that business or the project for so many different reasons, whether it's limited credit or there's a mismatch between the appraisal value and the financing needed. It might even be an unknown how CDFIs have been doing much of the leverage lending for new market transactions, because there is you don't have a direct mortgage. And for a long time, that was a very difficult thing for a traditional source to be able to do. CDFIs are not regulated, so our lending box is more flexible and can move and shape depending on the needs of the project. So if an LTV needs to be closer to 100%, then that is something that we could do because of our sources of capital. We are very similar to the New Markets program, certified by the U.S. Treasury Department through the CDFI fund. And so just by nature, CDFIs are CDEs. That because we have essentially the same mission and governing requirements. We can go to the next one. All right. So there are about 1,000 since this slide. It's a little bit over 1,000 CDFIs across the country, and they range from one-person CDFIs to, as we'll learn in the next slide, greater than $5 billion in assets. And there's all different types. I actually believe that you might have worked with a CDFI just not knowing it. There are many credit unions that are CDFIs. Smaller banks and community banks and regional banks are also CDFIs or have one within their bank. But those of us who do, and many of these do both. So you might be a loan fund and also a credit union or a bank. But many different types. And just as there are many different types of CDFIs, they also have many different focuses. Reinvestment Fund has a national footprint. We finance affordable housing, charter schools or education. We do some higher education like community colleges, community health centers, energy financing, and others might focus on simply affordable housing. Others also might just be a one city or a one state or just a regional CDFI. And we have examples of that in this transaction, which we'll point to soon. Next. So here's what I was talking about there is just a variety of CDFIs, and Reinvestment Fund is one of the largest. We have $1 billion in assets under management, been around since 1985. So if you'll notice, before CDFIs the CDFI fund was created. And it's really another way of sort of the original impact investors is you might think of as CDFI. As an example, some loan funds. The other thing that CDFIs are known for, and so while you'll see this variety of assets under management, many CDFIs are not focused on lending, but the technical assistance and support alongside any large complex project, even similar to this. So supporting the small businesses tenants that would be located within a large new market tax credit project is very much a role that you would find a CDFI playing. Doing housing counseling for home ownership, for former tenants to be first-time home buyers. That's a CDFI role that is integral to their own projects, but also larger projects. Next. So at this slide, you would actually need to go to the website on Opportunity Finance Network. That is our industry, the CDFI industries, like our industry organization. And you can find a CDFI near you. Community Works, which you've seen that name in here, they are located right in Greenville, and they focus on affordable housing. What you don't see South Carolina Community Loan Fund on this slides, but they were a participant in Reinvestment Fund's loan for the Judson Mill transaction. And their focus area is South Carolina. And so that is, there's behind the scenes CDFIs work together. Everything that we do is pretty much cooperative, not unlike the relationships with CDEs in transactions. And so how we got South Carolina Community Loan Fund involved and have done several projects in South Carolina with them to help them, because the goal is to introduce more CDFIs and who have this flexible capital to work with new market tax credit projects and other similar projects to get more impact to communities. Next. So the reason CDFIs we're talking about here is because they're much of the financing, the leverage sources for new market tax credit projects across the country are CDFIs are a part of those. And as I mentioned earlier, we don't necessarily have the same requirements and are able to have that separation of just providing the financing sources to a new market project that get leveraged through the structure without having that direct mortgage, which is most typical. In this case, we are partnered with Innovate Fund, who is the direct lender to the Qualic B in the transaction. In this transaction, Foss bridged their own historic tax credits, but that's another one of the many sources that went into this transaction. And the one other piece that I would like to note here is you'll see two loans on the bottom, Reinvestment Fund and Community Works together provided $1 million direct to the Qualic B. So that means it's not in the new market structure for the acquisition of the property. And that those terms can have a different structure than the source loan, which you can see the $5.5 million at the top. That is one of, so those $5.5 million, the $3.5 million of a historic tax credits, and there's additional sponsor equity that all make up the sources, the $12.3 million of sources that go into the structure. So those are the sort of the how the CDFIs and other institutions are able to play the role of leverage lender in transactions. And truthfully, we've done, Reinvestment Fund has done about 500 million of leverage lending and new market related lending over the last 10 years. And much of that is in partnership with we work with all of the different investors, but so Steve and Whitney and all the CDEs, it's a small world. And so you sort of figure out the structure, and then you know that they bring, can introduce Ken and team and say like, hey, can you do this? Is this, we can't get there. Are you able to get there? And here's the reasons and the roles that we need to play to do these sources. So.
Ken, would you say it takes a lot of patience to put one of these together?
Yeah, I was just going to say, it does, can you all hear me? I just want to make sure my audio is working okay.
Yeah, we do.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah, this is an org chart. I don't think I'm bearing any dirty secrets. Christina was not the first lender we talked to, right? Stephen was not the first investor we talked to. Tammy and Whitney Innovate was not the first CDE we talked to. So, you know, it takes a lot. Community Works actually helped us acquire the property, you know, 3 years ago. So pulling all that together is really important. So.
Yeah, I remember Ken used to drop by our office maybe about once a quarter for about 3 years, probably. He benefited by the fact that his architect was in the same office building as we were. So he used to drop by pretty often. And I know that when he was trying to find some of his leverage debt, was talking to a lot of different lenders and investors. And I think it was one of those other investors, Christina, that sort of let you guys know about the project. And then you reached out to me. And I think Ken just happened to be sitting in our office that day. So that's sort of how that connection was made.
Well, and one other thing I'll say really quickly here, just on the CDFI topic, is I think that what you'll see today in the New Markets Tax Credit arena for projects that are using New Markets Tax Credit financing is that we are often partnering with CDFIs as lenders because we are doing projects that otherwise won't get done. I mean, these are projects being done in distressed areas, not by bad businesses. To be clear, we're not investing in struggling businesses or developers. We're investing in potentially struggling communities or communities that need assistance. And so oftentimes these things don't pencil out for your traditional lenders. It's harder to get a bank loan in this day and age in 2020 from a bank, regardless of where it's located, for real estate in particular. So I would just underscore that the critical role that CDFIs play in our business and of redeveloping these communities right now, it just cannot be understated.
Yeah, and I would tack on there the effects of COVID-19, because I remember Ken had maybe one or two conventional lenders that were not signed up, but were pretty well thinking about doing the deal. And then COVID hit and they sort of changed their mind a little bit. Reinvestment Fund, being a CDFI, kind of stepped in there and made it happen.
And our first lender, our traditional commercial lender bailed, right? They said, look, we can't see how you get this project done in a post-COVID world. Not that they were wrong, but we understand they underwrite things differently than a CDFI does, and that's fine. So we had to be pretty nimble. So.
And the other, Ken actually had to answer lots of questions around healthy food access. He mentioned the Healthy Food Financing Initiative, and CDFIs, we have access or participate in programs. Reinvestment Fund, South Carolina Community Loan Fund have allocations from the Healthy Food Financing Initiative, which actually played a role here, and that is access to those, credit enhancement, are sometimes the way that we are able to support a project that other traditional sources are not able to get to the same place. So thanks for answering all those questions. But feed and seed was a very important reason, and that was part of the mission, very much so, for us to participate in this transaction and provide this debt, because otherwise they would not be able to move forward. So that is part of that but for. We needed them to be able to have significant running room to become stabilized. That's part of what the new market tax credit allows for, that not only the interest only period, but that below market rent is critical for that nonprofit success and the other tenants here.
Yeah, exactly. So I know we're kind of getting close to our official cutoff time, so we'll try to get through historic tax credits and some state tax credits pretty quickly. I think generally folks know more about historic tax credits than they do new markets or the work that CDFIs are doing, so we'll be pretty brief on these. So federal historic tax credits, it's an income tax credit that's available for the rehabilitation of historic income producing buildings. And so as Ken will tell you, it's generally a 3-part approval process, right? You get the building placed on the National Register of Historic Places. Ken did that work immediately after acquiring the Judson property. Then you submit your kind of design and construction plans to the National Park Service and your state historic preservation office. They'll approve it as a certified rehabilitation project. And then the Part 3 approval would be when they verify that you actually completed the work as they approved in Part 2. So it's a 20% income tax credit on your qualified rehabilitation expenditures. QREs basically get defined as hard costs, legal development costs, some architecture and engineering. The big ticket item that doesn't get counted as QREs would be your land and acquisition costs. And then it's claimed over a 5-year period. So if we go back to our structure chart here, moving pretty quickly, we had Foss & Company that was our federal historic tax credit equity investor, and they actually put their federal HTC equity into this master tenant entity, another sponsor affiliated entity, which master leases the property from our Judson Mill Building 2 entity over here. There is a rule within the historic tax credit program wherein the owner of the property that did the rehab work can elect to pass through the historic tax credits to its lessor. So it passes the credits to this master tenant, and then Foss will take an ownership interest in that entity so they can claim the historic tax credits and put in their $2.4 million of equity. Now, in a non-new market structure, that money could just go directly over here to help build or do the rehab work. Because we're still trying to fully fund this $12.3 million leverage loan, this master tenant entity loaned $2.1 million of the historic tax credit equity up to our leverage lender box to help fund that leverage loan. So a little bit of a complicated structure on historics as well, but just showing you that you can leverage federal historic tax credit equity through the new market tax credit structure. Did I miss anything there, Ken?
Nope, it's all about we're trying to get all the money up to the leverage lender, right? So at the end of the day, we took the federal historic, the state historic, reinvestment funds, leverage loan, and our equity. All of that money on the right-hand side, gets up to the leverage lender, because as Christina mentioned, it all needs to be available day one. So all that money needs to be advanced at closing and get up to the upper right-hand corner. And then we can put it into the new market structure to get it back down to the project, which that's the $18.8 million project. So.
Yeah. All right, let's get our last polling question in right before the 9:30 mark so that folks can get their CPE credit. So what's your best guess on how many states have a historic rehabilitation tax credit? Do any of my fellow panelists know the answer?
I don't even know that. No, I'll say I don't even know this one. If I had to guess,
I don't know this one either. I'm going to go with 30.
I was going to say 30 too.
I was going to say 30 as well. We're all thinking the same thing.
Uh-oh.
But I'm guessing that means it's probably not. I think
it's probably not 30. But...
It's not 50.
Can I call Bill McRosty?
Okay. So our attendees are smarter than our panelists here. The correct answer is 37.
Darn it.
An additional fun fact, basically all of the states in the Southeast have a state historic tax credit program with the exception of Tennessee. Tennessee is our only Southeast state that doesn't have a state historic tax credit. So just briefly, I've combined the South Carolina state historic tax credit and the South Carolina state textile credits on one slide here. South Carolina's state historic program mirrors the federal historic tax credit program, and basically what that means is if you qualify for the federal historic tax credit, you'll qualify for South Carolina's as well. I would say, and Mick Rosty might yell at me, I think most states' programs do mirror the federal, but not all of them, so just double check on that. For South Carolina's textile credit, South Carolina also has an abandoned building credit and an abandoned retail facility credit. You can only claim one of the three, and so Ken went with the textile credit on this one as opposed to the abandoned building credit. Maybe Ken can shed some light on that for us. But they're both pretty standard tax credits. And then if we go to our structure chart here, we've got Foss and Company again bringing in the state tax credit equity from one South Carolina fund, putting $3.5 million into our leverage lender box, which when we add in our sponsor equity, the $1.7 million, we've got $12.3 million now. So we can fully fund our leverage loan into our investment fund box so that the investment fund can fully fund the $16.5 million qualified equity investment. That's the technical transaction that actually generates the new markets tax credit so that Truist has something to purchase. And then the Innovate fund will take that $16.5 million and loan it down to our project. And then I think our last slide just sort of brings in a couple of sponsor equity arrows coming in just to top off the $18.8 million to get the project fully funded. And that's it, guys. That I'm sure it was easy for Ken. It wasn't stressful at all.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, and what I would say here, Whitney, to underscore that is you can see a lot of boxes here, and you can see Whitney on this call, Christina, Ken, myself, and there are others that were part of this. It really does take a lot of collaboration. It takes a lot of transparency. We work together as a team to make this happen. These aren't siloed. These things all have to work together. Every one of those arrows represents a legal document, right? Or multiple legal documents. So there are lots of lawyers involved. So the closing process can be time consuming. It can be expensive. So you don't do something like this for small projects, but the key is collaboration. And I just want to commend Ken and his team for doing a great job of bringing everybody together.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We couldn't, it does take a team, and it takes a full set of relationships. I guess if I could leave one, I'm happy to, I don't know if we're gonna have questions and answers at this point, but I'd say the one thing is, as you can see, there's a million reasons not to do transactions. Every box has to do its own underwriting, right? And trying to get everyone moving in the same direction and collaborating and saying, hey, look, I know this is an issue for the historic investor. How might we, I can't recall how many conversations, Christina, we had about an issue that maybe Steve had, or Foss had, or Whitney had, or, everyone has to kind of work together. And there's always a reason not to do it because they're challenging projects. So I appreciate everybody having a willingness to try to figure it out and being honest and saying, look, we can't do that, but we could do this. That's really important for anybody who's from a development sponsor side to understand what are those gating issues.
Yep, absolutely. So that's a wrap for us. I know we ran a few minutes over and didn't leave any time for questions, but I think we'll all hang around at least for another few minutes. And if anybody has questions, just toss them into the question box and we'll be happy to answer them. I want to thank Ken and Christina and Steve for participating in today's webinar. You were very gracious with your time and we very much appreciate it.
Yeah, and I would thank you, Whitney, for this opportunity to talk about the Judson Mill project. And I believe any of us are totally open to answering questions past, just send us an email. And so much of this happens through just these conversations, and it just started with an email or a sitting down in an office.
And one thing, I do see one question in there about how, with all those different parties in there, how do we manage construction draws? That's actually a really good question. And I'll just say this, it takes a village. Everybody has an opinion. Usually you're going to select one construction disbursement agent who's going to be your point person. But your investor is going to have an opinion. Your source lenders are going to have an opinion. Your CDEs are going to have an opinion. So all the more reason why getting people together and collaborating on the front end is important, because just closing it doesn't mean you're done. And on the new markets tax credit side, this is at a minimum a 7-year relationship, as I like to describe it. So great question.
Yeah, other than the sidebar legal conversations, it was probably the most negotiated document was the disbursement agreement, making sure everybody was clear about what has to happen to get money into the project.
Absolutely agreed on that.
Yeah, and the only other thing I would say in terms of how do you successfully navigate one of these things, and this isn't rocket science, but good counsel makes a huge difference. To your point, Ken, about legal negotiations. I mean, what I tell people over and over again is bring attorneys who bring experience, who understand the programs, and having not just somebody who understands historics but not new markets or vice versa. It's key. I mean, there are experts out there that understand these platforms. We're always happy to provide references, and I think more than anything else, you can tell by having people here. We're obviously passionate about not just the program but the project, right? The way you're going to see this succeed is to say Clemson a few times and get Christina excited, but obviously Whitney lives in the upstate, and really more than anything else, it's that local tie-in, right? You really want to get people to understand not just the project itself, but how that project, why it's important to the community. And I think if you can get your lenders, your CDE partners, your investors all tied in there, then they're going to go the extra mile, because these things are hard, they are complicated, it takes a lot of time and a lot of patience. It takes a lot of money, but that's part of what we're here for. The part of the new markets tax credit platform will help pay for a lot of those considerable costs.
Yeah, and hey, I'm a 2-time Clemson graduate, so I will agree with Christina about the Tigers. And I know, Ken, speaking to that a little bit, I know that your historic tax credit consultants were a really important piece on this too, that were really helpful helping you sort of navigate the ins and outs of historics and the state tax credits.
Yeah, so I mean, we had legal counsel on both the federal and state. Mick Rosty Historic Advisors, they're out of Washington, D.C., but they have an office in Charleston. They were instrumental in making sure that, there's a lot of money that we borrowed from FOSS and put it into the transaction. So making sure that you've got a great historic advisor and a strong architect team. McMillan Pasden's a local architect that we worked with. They actually have offices right where Whitney's Innovate's actually in their offices for the time being. And then the other thing I would say is, interesting in the COVID time, usually Stephen and the equity side is the easiest piece of the puzzle, right? It's like, yeah, let me know when the deal is fully baked, and Whitney will then get proposals from several investors. The investment community all but dried up in March or April, May, right? So that was another challenge in this project, where because of the relationships that we had with BB&T and Christina had with SunTrust and Whitney had with others, I think we all kind of said, hey, we want to get this done, but we need an investor. So I think that was another, I'll say interesting wrinkle in this particular transaction, because, the financing world really did change, 6-7 months ago when we were trying to get this to the closing table.
Yeah. All right, so obviously the four of us will sit here and talk about this all day long, but I don't see any other questions popping in, so I think we are safe to end this thing.
All right, we'll call it a wrap.
Well, thanks again, everybody, for your time. And Ken, congratulations again, and hope everybody has a great day.
Thank you. I appreciate everybody's help. Have a
Thank
great
you.
day.
Thank you.
Yeah.